Thursday night football recap, what we're looking for as we look ahead to Sunday, and some interesting zero RB stashes. That's what we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find my Stealing Signals newsletter over at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. Find all of his work at RotoViz, including the zero RB playbook we're going to talk a little bit about, but you have the whole write-up from him over there this week. And Shawn, we spent last week talking about Thursday Night Football. It's going to be maybe a fun tradition for our Saturday shows to break down Thursday night. We got the Browns and the Steelers. Honestly, a more exciting game than I thought we were going to get. It was a windy game. I don't think either of these passing games is particularly good, but they showed some things in this game that at least made it not terrible football from start to finish. We got the George Pickens catch, which I was telling you before the show, I think is a top 5 all-time catch. I don't know that I sold you on that, but it was, at least from a skill perspective. I mean, I don't know how you get much, but it was like the quintessential one-handed catch, completely contorted body, parallel to the ground, battling the wind, clean catch. Some of those one-handers are still very good plays, but they're kind of deflected back to you and you get a little bit of good fortune. He just caught it very cleanly. Incredible physical play that I have basically not stopped thinking about. But yeah, a lot of stuff to talk about in the Thursday night game. What were some big thoughts that you had?
Well, I think that the biggest thing is that Kevin Stefanski is a fantastic head coach, and he's doing some of these things without the benefit of a star QB. We also talked a little bit in the offseason about how Geno Smith had a chance to be better than people expected because he's stuck in the NFL. He got better. Sometimes these guys, when you think of someone like a Ryan Fitzpatrick, they can have this second act to their career where a lot of the elements that made them an interesting prospect, maybe not an elite prospect when they came into the NFL, then allows them to be a starter who, if the rest of your team is good, can help you get at least much of the way to where you need to be. We saw a nice game from Joe Flacco in week 2. Obviously, he's someone who has won a Super Bowl and got the big contract after that, despite probably not deserving it. It's going to be interesting to watch him as well. But the big storyline from week 2, and then definitely carrying on to week 3, is just how fantastic Jacoby Brissett has looked. And it hasn't just been that he's been good or solid or has been a game manager. I mean, he has looked awesome. You think about the game that Amari Cooper had last night, and it was a big game, an excellent game, definitely a surprising game to me, but one where, I mean, when these guys go out there and show you, I mean, you want to root for them as opposed to be disappointed. I mean, it's disappointing from a fantasy perspective if you're playing against him, but this is cool. And I mean, he did have his own sort of Dan Orlovsky performance there where he maybe was out of bounds for a longer portion of one of his pass routes than you would.
Then he was inbounds.
Right. And he did have the play late where Brissett basically just overpowered him, even though he was way down the field. I mean, that ball's an absolute rocket and goes off of his face mask. But Amari Cooper played extremely well. David Njoku played extremely well. We had a situation through the first 2 weeks where, and you can pull these things up in the fantastic Stealing Signals tool, named in honor of who else other than Ben Gretch, who has the fantastic Stealing Signals newsletter. You can see that the first 2 weeks, Njoku 71% routes, Harrison Bryant 44% routes, but the target per route for Njoku down at 12%, Bryant 26%. He's not a factor in this game, and as a result, Njoku's numbers absolutely skyrocket. 10 targets. So Brissett throws 31 passes, 21 of them are to Cooper and Njoku. If you have those guys, you love how concentrated that is. It's those two players and then Nick Chubb, especially a little bit of an assist from Kareem Hunt. To be able to build a run-first offense with a backup quarterback in 2022, even if in part what you've done the last couple of weeks is probably prey on some of the NFL's worst defenses. I mean, that TJ Watt injury for Pittsburgh has turned them from a potentially dynamic unit to really a cellar dwelling unit. This Pittsburgh Steelers team is absolutely awful. And I'll be interested to see what changes they make because they have this long winning streak. We have all of these coaching records. You and I were hoping that maybe a QB change would be part of that. But I think the first thing that we have to do is give credit to the Cleveland Browns and just how well they played last night.
Yep, I think that's well said. My notes for stealing signals, it's like you have access to him. You wrote down, you mentioned everything that I wrote down about Amari. I said he looked good. I said I need to have a little bit of a mea culpa on him because he has looked very strong. I wrote that he went comically far out of bounds before catching that pass. Should he have gotten the personal foul penalty that the punt gunners get when they don't try to come back on the field quick enough? Because he was running out of bounds so long that, like, I think maybe that I don't think there's a rule for that on pass plays, but it could have been that he wasn't trying to get back in the field for too long that it needed to be a penalty.
I don't think he knew. He wasn't just barely out.
He was few steps running clearly on the white.
I mean, we have to take a little bit of the humor from it where we can because he had a huge game.
And it was funny, too, because the throw was in a good spot. Again, to your comments about Brissett, and he comes back in the field to where the throw's going. And by the time, the camera's there and you're tracking the ball, he's in bounds, catches it. I see the flag, and I was kind of curious what it was. They called it, and I was like, oh, man, it's interesting. Let's get a look at this. Let's see where he stepped out. And it's like, he would have just ran out of bounds for another 40 yards if the ball was thrown 40 yards further. I mean, the throw is what brought him back in. But I also had in my notes, I didn't do targets, I did receptions, that they had 16. Him and Njoku had 16 of the 21 receptions. I made a little comment in Stealing Signals last week about Amari Cooper's strong game, that it was going to be hard to keep that up in this offense, at least, until maybe late in the season. But for now, I mean, it's a very run-heavy offense. They're looking to keep the pass attempts and the pass volume somewhat limited and work it off the run. And the offense really flows through. And we talked about this, I think, more last year, Shawn, and we're going to talk about it plenty this year. I don't know if we've really touched on it a lot, but we like to think about some of these offenses in terms of, like, what's their engine? What makes them run? What is the offense flowing through? Who are their go-to guys, so to speak? It really flows through the Chubb Hunt tandem. I mean, this is an offense where
35 combined carries last night.
And that feels like it's going to be a weekly thing. I mean, I think that was the case in weeks 1 and 2, very close. I know at least one of them, Chubb had another 20 carry game where Hunt had like 11. You're going to get 30 total touches out of these two weekly. They're both very startable because it isn't off. I mean, typically we would not talk about a backfield as if two running backs matter, but like one of the things that we always kind of focus on is there are always exceptions to rules, and there's, you have to be flexible. We have guidelines, and Hunt is a legitimate starter. You got to analyze the players on their own, and Hunt is a legitimate starter in his own right for fantasy football because he's going to get like 15 touches a game in an efficient offense and have, the potential for some goal line role. Chubb looks fantastic. And I wrote that after week 1. The way that this offense ran in week 1, I mean, I almost was like, been out on Chubb for a long time. He's the player that I'm regretting not having more of, not Amari here, because this offense is so heavily dictated through the running backs that even though he doesn't have necessarily the touch mix that we want and all of that, he's gotten like so many touches when they get down into scoring range. And they've had bad opponents, and they might have some bad scoring weeks where they don't get a lot of those plays, but he's going to score double-digit touchdowns very easily. He's going to probably set a career high in carries. He's always sort of had a carry limit, but they're going to have so many. This pie is so big that he's now carrying 20 times a game, even though his running back, rush attempt share, if you look at it that way, is not elite and is not going to be elite. We talk about 30 carries a game for the running backs. And even if they trail, I think they're going to continue to do that. So the only concern for Amari that I would mention, you said, it's a positive. I completely agree with that Amari and Njoku, it was such a concentrated passing game and they dominated the work. It is a positive. At the same time, it is very difficult to catch 30+% of your team's passes every week. They both did that this week, at least 30%. Amari had exactly 30%, 7 of the 21. They combined for 190 of the 220 passing yards. I mean, that's a level of concentration that becomes unsustainably concentrated.
Right. And we saw the big target game from Donovan Peoples-Jones in week 1. Last night, David Bell played virtually the entire game. Now, it was disappointing to see him catch that ball across the middle and really kind of demonstrate the concern that people have, which is this lack of athleticism, because he's tackled from behind there where, you got to get that first down. Now, part of that is just looking at guys that you have a lot of exposure to and you want them to be awesome. And maybe you are a little bit more critical in some cases. If it's somebody else who goes and makes that catch, then I probably don't notice it and don't feel like, you've got to, you had the gap on the guy. You can't let him immediately get there, tackle you short of the first down. He's going to be involved. I'm not worried about losing to Chubb teams. I'm not worried about losing to Amari Cooper teams. I didn't think I would be saying this in a million years. I'm a little bit concerned about Njoku because he looked good last night. One of the things, again, that you pull up very easily, and I just feel like it is a big red flag for him when you consider kind of where he was already in his development. Last year, 2021, 51% routes, Austin Hooper, 49% routes. When you're not separating from Austin Hooper, that's a huge red flag. And then he has the first 2 games of the season where Harrison Bryant is so involved. And again, if you can't separate from those guys, that's a concern. But you watch the game last night and say, okay, that's unsustainable. He's not going to score at that level, but he can score at a level way down from that and still be a big impact player at the tight end position. The tight end position is completely barren. So suddenly, if we can get 60% of this from Njoku going forward, those teams are going to be in pretty good shape.
Yeah, that's a fair point. He's a concern at a tight end position that is weak and doesn't have a lot of upside plays. A concern if you don't have him. I get that. Part of my point on Chubb as well is that the running back position looks weak. There's not a lot of running backs near the top that look very good. And the fact that we were able to get him at a 3rd round price this offseason is interesting. You think about the teams that started a receiver might have a Kupp or a Jefferson or a Chase or a Diggs or a whoever, and then also have, an AJ Brown in the 2nd round or a Tyreek Hill, and then they took Chubb in the 3rd round. Those are the teams that I'm a little bit concerned about because the running back position is down as well. Chubb, 341 rushing yards through 3 games. That's got a pace pretty close to 2,000 over 17. And I think it would it would be more than 2,000 if I'm not mistaken. 30 extra or 40 extra yards every 3 games. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's 1,900. 4 touchdowns in 3 games. Then you're talking about a 20 TD pace. It's
very similar to what we got from, or has similarities to what we got from Derrick Henry during his really hot 7-game stretch from week 2 to week 8 last year before the injury, but without the price tag. When I was looking through my underdog teams, I think I have 1 or 2 lit Chubb, and not surprisingly, that team was one of the best teams through a couple weeks, and obviously.
But the point I was going to make is he's only at 21.6 PPR points per game. We talk a lot about trying to get to like 25 points per game. The 21, 22 range is good, but it's not really legendary upside like we talked about from Pat Kerrane's article last offseason. But you look at last year, and one of the points I made on Taylor this offseason was how he had 22.2 points per game. It was the lowest RB1 season since Devonta Freeman in 2015, the overall RB1. There had been higher ceiling running backs to lead the running back position every year since 2015. And Eckler was right behind him, 21.6. No one else who played the majority of the year had more than 18.3. That was Leonard Fournette. And so when you only have 2 guys hitting 20 points per game. So, I don't know if Chubb can keep up this 21.6. And right now it's playing up because there aren't anyone else. There aren't a lot of other running backs that are, in this range. And there's the potential that some of these guys still distance, right? Saquon or Christian McCaffrey, obviously. Jonathan Taylor, obviously. I think they all have the potential to have 23, 24, 25 points per game. But in an atmosphere that this year looks like it could be headed towards, where 20 points, there might only be a couple running backs that hit 20 points per game. Nick Chubb could be pretty valuable as a 3rd round pick.
Yeah, and when I was putting together the playbook, and it was a possibility for having it a Thursday article as opposed to a Friday article, decided to put the updated wide receiver dynasty rankings out first this week instead, talking about how through 2 weeks we had 5 backs who were averaging more than 18 points per game. 2 of those guys go with the 1-2 turn in Barkley and Swift. Thankfully, you and I do have quite a bit of exposure there. We'll see if they can keep that up. Obviously, it's going to be a challenge. You have Aaron Jones deep in round 2. You have Nick Chubb buried in round 3. And then you look at kind of how they're doing it. Chubb at 8.5 fantasy points over expectation. Jones at 9.9 fantasy points over expectation.
It's just not sustainable.
No, and one of the things, and you want to emphasize running back efficiency, right? And that's one of the reasons why Jones was going early and earlier still than I think he should over the last 3 years, right? So this isn't like some tiny 2 or 3 week stretch. Over the last 3 years, Jones is at 3 points per game, more than his volume would suggest. Chubb is at 2.6. On a single year, I mean, those guys could hit 5, right? And so if you're in the 15 expected point per game range, you could hit 20. I mean, they're that good. They could score that many touchdowns. But it's difficult, right? Because you have to be a superstar the whole way to get to a league winning type of level. You just simply can't have the volume that you need when you have an elite sidekick, and especially with Chubb. I mean, he's just not going to catch the passes. So we have such a narrow path.
That's the case that we made sort of against Chubb and against Aaron Jones in draft season. And they've gotten off to these really hot starts. So you don't want to, I mean, we knew they were efficient players. We knew this was possible. This is part of the range of outcomes over a smaller stretch. The ability to sustain that for 17 games. Their workloads haven't been big enough to justify their point scoring is sort of what you're saying. And we do talk about how the old way of thinking of opportunity and efficiency can sometimes be a little bit misleading, but this is a great example of where the efficiency is so big that you just expect natural regression one way or another. Touchdown stop, big play stop, whatever it is. Like there's going to be some type of regression. It's too efficient. And so, yeah, Chubb probably doesn't finish at 21.6 unless the role gets even bigger, which there's nothing to indicate over his career that it will. This is frankly one of the biggest roles he's had. He's averaging over 20 carries a game. He's never been particularly close to that. His closest season was his second year back in 2019. He was at 18.6. The last 2 years, right around 16 carries a game. Again, he's been up over 20 to start for the first 3 games of this year. He might stick around 20, but then you'd have to also stick the efficiency that you talked about. That's astronomical so far to be at 21 points per game, not to be at 25, right?
And one of the things that Stefanski has done as well is demonstrate that because of the quality of his play calling and the quality of the offensive line, that they can bring in a third guy if Kareem Hunt goes down, and that player will be efficient enough that they can move the ball and still get the total number of touches that they want for Chubb without giving him like a Derrick Henry 2021 level of touches. So you don't really have, like with Aaron Jones, I think we have this injury path where if A.J. Dillon gets hurt, then Jones becomes someone who could be the overall RB1. We just still don't really have that with Chubb.
Yeah, unless the position is that weak. And I do think there's a case to be made that it could be that weak after last year.
Oh, you don't like how the Colts and Panthers offenses look?
No, I don't like how any running back position looks. I've seen a lot of complaints about there's not as many good pickups at running back. And we'll get to some of your thoughts on stashes and ideas. And what I've seen it chalked up to is that drafters have gotten smarter. They got smarter with the dead zone, so they've gotten smarter with the stashes. I don't necessarily think that's true. I don't think there's like massively more running backs being held. It's possible that because a lot of people avoided the dead zone, there are more teams that have more running backs. I actually think the drafters that used to go robust running back early would then still hit too many running backs late. And you'd have these teams that had 6, 7, 8 running backs. I think in a lot of these leagues, probably there are fewer. I'm talking kind of about like main event type leagues. We see a lot of different drafts. It's a consistent format, so we can kind of analyze pretty serious players. That there was definitely a shift in draft strategy in terms of taking a lot of running backs early, but I don't think that necessarily means that more total running backs have been held because all those teams took a ton late. It's possible, but I don't think it's huge. What I think is the case with the stashes not being as exciting is there's just not a lot of interesting running back spots anywhere. And a lot of the ways that we think of good stashes are like, I like to look at team high value touches and stealing signals. These are offenses where we want to be interested in the backups, right? And there are no offenses where the running backs look exciting. The Browns are one of them, and it's a split offense. And I always try to emphasize you want both an exciting offense in terms of total running back production and the potential to have all of the production to really have a workhorse type role. If you can't have that, short of that, you want to be splitting in an offense that has a ton of work. Splitting in an offense that doesn't have a lot of work can be really problematic. We could talk about the Seahawks, for example. I'm actually really curious your updated thoughts on Rashaad Penny and Ken Walker, two guys you had on the 0RB watch list. They've run fewer than 50 plays 2 games in a row. They're not going to stay that low, but the pie for running back touches has been so small that it's tough to split when you get into those scenarios. And then what you definitely don't want is that you can also get there through having the workhorse role in a sort of a bad running back offense. You can be decent. So the split in a really good running back offense or the workhorse in a bad offense, kind of similar in my mind. The really bad scenario is a split in a bad running back offense. The really good scenario, obviously, having a workhorse role in a really good running back offense. That's the kind of thing that's boosted up Leonard Fournette the last couple of years, even though we haven't really been super fond of him as a player when you're playing in an offense like Tampa Bay's, which hasn't been great for running back points so far this year, but and you're getting all the work that it's going to carry you to a certain degree.
I almost think that we have to come in and say, be a little pro running back and just say these things are going to evolve. The wide receivers are not going to score as many points as they have. The running backs are going to score more. Some of these offenses are going to look better. They're going to get figured out what they need to do. And yeah, I mean, if you didn't draft running backs or didn't draft the right running backs, and now you're 2 weeks in and you feel like you haven't been able to pick somebody up, that is a concern. But mostly we just haven't seen these specific types of things happen yet that are going to happen during the course of the season. We're only 2 weeks in. It's easy to think in terms of things we've seen on the field, the big games in week 1 versus the bad games, and say, okay, I know that some of these are going to flip in week 2. Some of these are going to flip in week 3. But when you don't get injuries or you don't get some of the team level things that you're looking for, sometimes those, it's easy to forget. These things are also going to evolve. Injuries are going to happen in some of these offenses where it would make a difference. And again, I mean, we're not rooting for that. It just simply is what is going to happen. You're going to have a few of these offenses that are more favorable for running back scoring. They're going to have some openings. Again, I just keep going back to the fantasy playoffs last season and how the guys who were such big impact players, I mean, you wouldn't have guessed that in the middle of the season last year. So when we talk about not overreacting, I think more than some of the individual performances, where I think we do want to take some of that and say these individual performances matter, there are a lot of things on the team level and at the injury level, and especially when you're dealing with the backups and what the roles will be, those things are going to change a lot over the next 6 weeks, and then they're going to keep changing as we head toward the fantasy playoffs.
Definitely. Let's talk about how those things could change, because we talked about things we're looking forward to. There's probably a lot of ways we could go with that, but we also want to talk a little bit about the 0RB list. I agree with you there. Again, to get back to some people's concern about there not being as many good stashes, I do think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the overall running back pies for a lot of these offenses are not as big. What you're suggesting is that some of them could get bigger and that we should expect a shift. So what I think is an interesting angle is what offenses might be fun to target. I just pulled up the RotoViz screener, it's probably my favorite RotoViz tool. You got so many amazing tools over at RotoViz, but you can go into the screener, you can set it to 2022, you can set the position to just running back, you can set the variables to rushing expected points and receiving expected points, the stats that Shawn loves to bring up as it relates to running back role and usage and opportunity. You can search, you can click over to the tab team level, and you can look at all this yourself from a team perspective. What the running backs specifically, again, that's why you set it to running back position, what the running backs specifically are getting in rushing expected points and receiving expected points. Unsurprisingly, the Browns tied at the top of the league for the most rushing expected points so far. They also have more receiving expected points than I think will probably sustain. But they have 19.5 rushing expected points total, 10.8 receiving. You're talking about 30 expected points at the running back position combined. That's the kind of thing that's amazing. I obviously, just doing this now, have not gone and looked back to past years, but I would imagine there's more teams in that range in, especially a couple of years ago, maybe not in last year, because we talked about how a lot of the running back scoring was down even last year. Go back 2-3 years, I think we would see a lot of teams in the 25 plus expected point range relative to what we're seeing now, which is, and some of these teams are really high. Philadelphia is third in rushing expected points, also has 10 receiving. That's a really strong number, but it's a split backfield. They use 3 backs, and I've been concerned that even if Miles Sanders goes down, they're just going to activate Trey Sermon and still use 3 backs. Sean, you and I talked about trying to add potentially Boston Scott this week, and I was like, I don't get it with Boston Scott. He played 15 snaps last week. He has a little bit of a role, but I'm so concerned about how they're going to continue to split things that I just don't know a path where I'm going to feel like he's anything other than touchdown or bust, which if you look at his game log last year, had some strong games, particularly when he scored touchdowns. I mean, you're just trying to predict touchdowns, I think, a little bit. This is a good offense for running back value, though. It does get sapped a little bit, too, by Jalen Hurts rushing for 150 yards and 3 touchdowns through the first couple of games. Denver is way up there. 15 rush expected points, 17 receiving so far. We know in week 1, obviously, Javonte Williams had a huge receiving line. That's over 30 total expected points. Again, split backfield. It's nice to see Javonte move to a 65% snap share last week. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to sustain. I do think so far this year, we've seen a bunch of factors lead to the Javonte Williams RB1 season being more in play now than it was in draft season, which was tough, which is number one, that there hasn't been any massive seasons to start the year from the workhorses. He's not going to be a full-on workhorse necessarily. And then number two, it's that he got to the 65% snap share already this early. If he can be 2/3 of the snaps in an offense that has a ton of volume and be efficient, I think he can flirt with a really great season. And he's still a guy that I really like at this point. Looking through the rest, Cincinnati, Green Bay, Indianapolis are more that have, up over 25 receiving, total expected points. San Francisco, another split one. Detroit, another split one. Cincinnati, it's a big reason Mixon's look so good. One of the few in that list that has been pretty dominant to one player. Indianapolis as well, obviously Jonathan Taylor, but Green Bay on this list, again, 2 running backs very involved. And then just not a lot more. They're like Arizona has not been great so far. They're right around 25, but that's a backfield that's been historically pretty strong in expected points and could get better. And Connor got hurt in week 2, and so it's been more split there than maybe we would have expected. Are there offenses, though, even among those that I named or haven't named, that you think might end up being a lot better for running backs than we've seen through a couple weeks?
Yeah, the first one for me is going to be the Dolphins. And this is a situation where I think that maybe the pie at the running back position does stay lower than we would want, but because the offense overall is so dynamic, I think that this is a chance to buy low and to buy low on Mostert. 39-36 edge in snaps last week, a 6-1 edge in carries in the first half. He splits the targets evenly, which I don't expect that necessarily to continue, but I mean, that specifically is a dagger for Chase Edmonds. He gets, right to the edge of 11 points in week 2, again in this game that is so pass heavy. The Dolphins join the Saints and the Seahawks as teams without a green zone carry through 2 weeks. I think that they'll have more than the Saints and the Seahawks. The difference between those 3 teams, or the Dolphins and the other 2, is that Miami looks like a high-powered offense. Waddle and Hill are not going to score from distance every time. You get some of those tackles on the 1-yard line. We talk about how many times Justin Jefferson was tackled on the 1-yard line last year. You're going to have opportunities there. Mostert still, I think, looks like the guy who could be the big winner from that group. And I think he should still be the less expensive, or at least in a lot of leagues, in a lot of situations, he's someone that you could go out and potentially get. The trade cost on him shouldn't be through the roof. So kind of looking at zero RB through the lens of what are some trades that you could make? What are some deep stashes you could make? Maybe who are some guys you could look for in shallow leagues? And I think especially if you're sitting there and you have Drake London, Garrett Wilson, Jahan Dotson, and then maybe you have some players with bigger names. I'm not saying necessarily move them, because maybe it's a little bit of one of these things where you want to believe so much that you don't want to sell high on them. I mean, you certainly don't want to miss if they hit a bunch of those games later. But if you have players with bigger names like a Terry McLaurin, he's not somebody that you and I have, but a DK Metcalf, maybe even a Deontay Johnson, a DJ Moore, names that you could move. A couple of other guys where I do think actually the value in the offense is going to be there. Travis Etienne, Breece Hall. Yeah, they have that name element to them, but they also have the disappointment of being pretty clearly the number 2 in both of those offenses, and yet they've looked fantastic. So if you can buy low in a trade environment with them, number one, I think the standalone value, even as the backup, is going to be there, and you can dive into the numbers and see that. But then number 2, if they work into the starting role, the value will be there. And if in an unfortunate situation, their sort of co-number 1 gets injured, then obviously massive value would be there in those offenses.
I think those are great names to target. I agree with you on the way to play Miami. I guess I have concerns sort of to play devil's advocate on 2 of those offenses in particular. Miami, I don't think the signs have been great for the running back receiving overall to be very good. I think, and you kind of said you don't expect it to jump a ton. They only have about 16 expected points total for Miami so far. I don't really see a lot of paths to that changing a ton. They've run a lot of plays. They've been efficient. They've been good. Mostert did run the same number of routes as Edmonds last week, which was fantastic. You mentioned the targets, but also the routes backed it up. In week 1, Edmonds ran quite a few more routes. They're also getting Alec Ingold, their fullback, involved a little bit. I've mentioned him a few times, kind of a silly point, but I do think it's notable because if you go back and look at San Francisco where they've used Juszczyk, they've not had a running back have a true running back, big receiving numbers, basically in the Kyle Juszczyk era. And then you also have the way they're using Tyreek Hill kind of close to the line of scrimmage on a lot of stuff, focusing so many targets on Waddle and Hill. I just think it's really pretty tough for the overall running back receiving pie to get too big in that offense. They could add a lot of rushing expected points if their offense is really good. And I hear that part of it. On the Jets so far, 8.4 rushing expected points, one of the lowest numbers in the league. Miami, one of the only 3 teams that are lower. 21 receiving expected points. That, to me, is a Joe Flacco stat and something that when Zach Wilson is back could be a problem as well. But I'm with you on Hall, too. If you can get him cheaply, he has looked fantastic. It was frustrating to see in comeback mode this week. After week 1, only Michael Carter and Breece Hall played offensive snaps. In comeback mode in week 2, Ty Johnson comes in and plays quite a bit in the receiving game, and it came directly at the expense of Breece Hall's receiving. That's early rookie season stuff, probably. And I think you want to almost emphasize that to a trade partner if you can. You know, the old tactic, and it's kind of probably out of favor in 2022. But to your point, Sean, he's looked very good. We're not trying to necessarily predict role in those types of things long term. We know there's a lot of chaos that can ensue. I always go back to Jonathan Taylor's rookie year. They didn't really like what they saw from him for 6 or 7 weeks. They went from, I think it was week 8 to week 10, giving him very few touches, his 3 lowest touch counts of the year in 3 straight weeks, barely did anything in those games. Came back, got a monster workload. Then I think he missed a game due to COVID. This is 2020. And then came back after that and had just an unbelievable stretch down the stretch. And we've basically seen that continue since, right? He's Jonathan Taylor. But there was a stretch there where people thought Jonathan Taylor was a bust and were calling him a bust, and he looked terrible because he had a tough start for a few weeks and then lost work because of it. Talk about the Hall losing routes. It's disappointing to see. It also might be low-key good for trying to go and get him in a trade, and it's not likely with how good he has looked in the draft capital that's been put into him that they're going to just not use him this season. There's a lot of ways that things can work in his favor. So I like that point a lot. Jacksonville in particular, though, I agree really firmly with, and I think the Etienne one is a great call because their offense looks a lot more competent without Urban Meyer. And I don't know. What were your thoughts on James Robinson? I kind of feel bad saying this because we really do. I mean, I've made this point multiple times in Stealing Signals, but I really do love to see him succeeding. I think it's the coolest story so far. I'm not that concerned about the fact that I wasn't on him in fantasy football. I really am not. I mean, he's a cool player. He's a fun player. I've had him on teams in the past, and he's been a fun guy to have on teams. UDFA, great story, tears his Achilles, and it's really an unfortunate thing. And you feel for the guy who's been so good to this point in his career. To come back and be as productive as he has really this year is great. But in terms of predicting forward in fantasy football, I thought week 2 was a little bit concerning. He got 23 carries. He was not very efficient on those carries. He actually had the 37-yard TD run that made all the highlight reels and was very exciting. I thought he did not look like he had the long speed back on that play. I'm curious your thoughts on watching that play. And then if you take that out, and obviously we don't just take out the best play of a guy's sample, but if you take that out, 22 carries for 27 yards on his other carries. So even if you add it back in, he was very poor from a yards per carry standpoint. We talked in week 1, but he's after week 1 about how he's the type of guy that he'll do what you need him to do. He will handle his role. And I still think that's true. He's a good pass catcher. He's good in the red zone, all of those elements. But if the burst looks like it's there. If he doesn't have the long speed, and if he has a lot of these games, no saying he'll stack them together, but it could be a warning sign where he's running for like 2 yards per carry. Etienne looks good enough that I think, we've already seen a flip. And I think in the short term, if you're playing DFS this week, you have to look at James Robinson's work and think that he's the better play. But while acknowledging we've already seen a flip from the August draft positions, I think we could see a flip back. And I'm expecting that we'll see a flip back based on what we saw from Robinson in week 2.
Yeah, part of this, I think, is still that, teams don't need to respect the Jacksonville passing game, even though Christian Kirk has played pretty well and Trevor Lawrence has played pretty well. You're not getting a ton from Zay Jones. You're not getting a ton from Marvin Jones. I think that opens this up for Travis Etienne to end up with a huge number of receptions, an element that, we talk about how things are going to evolve. I think we're going to see that from him. You mentioned how poor James Robinson was on the rest of those carries. That part, certainly, we're not playing him. We're just rooting for him. But that part, frustrating. I think the most impressive play that I've seen from him this year was just a route that he ran early in the season where he wasn't even targeted, but his ability to change direction was extraordinary. I guess I'm not too worried about him. I'm more enthusiastic about Etienne. Now, in mentioning the numbers for Etienne and mentioning the numbers for Breece Hall, hopefully everybody understands that these are really tiny samples, and we're not saying that they're going to put these numbers up for the season. It's more an element where in the early going, as players who lack experience at the NFL level, these numbers very much are in the same direction as what we saw from them as college players. James Robinson has an evasion rate so far that would put him among the league leaders if you could do it for a whole season. Obviously, it's very different in 2 weeks. Etienne only has the 13 carries, but his evasion rate is even higher. He's averaging more yards after contact than Robinson. They're both at 3 or above. Again, a lot of that is fluky, but at the same time, it's positive. I kind of had mentioned in one of my early bold predictions articles, I don't remember even what the prediction was for Travis Etienne, but my claim was that he looked like he was operating at a different speed than everybody else. And you kind of joked with me in our show after that was the one that you didn't agree with. In some ways, Etienne looks smaller out there, maybe than I was expecting. But in terms of the explosiveness, I do still feel that about him, that what he can potentially do as a breakaway player throughout the course of the season. Not that he's going to be Chris Johnson, not that he's even going to be, what J.K. Dobbins was as a rookie, but when you're talking about somebody who could average 5.5 yards per attempt on a pretty decent full season workload by the time we get through all 17 weeks, I like him there. Breece Hall, somebody again with just a handful of touches, but he's at 2.7 yards before and after contact at that level or above. We talk about Jamal Charles and his numbers and why he was able to average such gaudy yards per carry. It has to come in both. There was a play this week where Breece Hall looked like he'd been shot out of a literal cannon. And I think that he was someone who was always undervalued because something about his running style doesn't make him look quite as athletic as he tests and as he obviously is in terms of the numbers that he puts up, relative to whatever competition level he's facing at that point. I guess I'm just very excited about what we've seen from him a couple of weeks. You mentioned Ty Johnson getting out there. That was extremely frustrating and I think a little bit surprising, because if Breece Hall isn't playing, you really want that to be Michael Carter, because Michael Carter is just so good as well. Yeah. That's hugely frustrating for both players. It reminds me a little bit of one that was more expected, which was, you mentioned the Seattle Seahawks and how just disturbing and gross and frustrating that situation is there. The number one thing is just that they haven't run any plays. But beyond that, when you're not running any plays and then the handful of plays you do run, you're way behind and Travis Homer is out on the field. That part, I think, is also a concern. But like the situation with Ty Johnson, and I know that Travis Homer is one of the reasons that some analysts were a little bit further down. It's one of the reasons that Penny and Walker both made it to where they were, is that there was this specter that there could be a third guy who siphons off a little bit of value. And if it's receptions, they don't have to be that many total touches to really take a chunk out of the EP that we've been talking about. But what we saw in week 2 was that Walker gets out there and he takes almost all of what we might have considered to be Rashaad Penny's receiving work. That part's not great for Penny, but it is something where, and this is maybe an element where I've disagreed with the people who are concerned about Homer. It'll be interesting to see how, again, that part of it evolves. You mentioned you don't think Ty Johnson will be that involved late. I don't think that Homer can be someone that they continue to go to. If they're going to draft Kenneth Walker and they're going to play in an offense that probably will be low volume, it's hard not to react to 2 weeks of seeing that. It's hard not to think to yourself, well, the Seahawks could be in the mix for setting a record for fewest plays per game for an NFL season. I mean, probably they won't, but they don't look like they're going to run a lot of plays. If you have Rashaad Penny and Ken Walker, those guys have to be the players who are out there on the field. Both of them are actually fine as receivers as the season moves along. I mean, I think even in some of these plays where Homer is currently ticketed for the role, it's got to be the other guys just to make sure they get Penny and Walker on the field enough. Ben, you were laughing. You do not believe, even after Pete Carroll has come out and said, we've got to be aggressive. We've got to play like a real NFL
How many times
offense.
has Pete Carroll talked out of one side of his mouth and done the other?
I mean, every time.
You're saying it has to be something, but like my question to you is, are you aware of who the Seahawks coach is? Because every time we've talked about the Seahawks, you've had a little bit of optimism, and my response has basically been that, like, even after the trade, like there's other things that, like, you saw a path after the trade to where they could build a good team. And I think my best counter argument ultimately became, but they're not going to take that path. They're going to do some stupid stuff instead. They're using Noah Fant, Sean, on like 50% of their routes. They're just, they actually have a dynamic tight end in this offense that could help Geno Smith. Will Dissly's been okay, but like, it doesn't just use them both. Like you can't afford to take Noah Fant off the field. Like what again, low volume offense. You're running Noah Fant out there for like 15, 20 routes a game. I don't know the exact numbers, but he obviously has more routes in him in a football game. They make these types of decisions across the board everywhere. They're just not.
But they're not sustainable.
I think for Pete Carroll, they are.
They're going to make some different weird decisions. But Geno has played okay. We had Tyler Lockett was excellent in week 2. They have a path to get to their players who have the talent that they need. And I think that, I mean, the NFL has a way of forcing you into that, even if you would prefer to run formations that consisted exclusively of blocking tight ends and fullbacks. There are only a certain number of plays you can run that way before you look at your record and you think to yourself, I'm going to get fired if we don't have Noah Fant and the running backs that we spent all of these resources on the field.
I can't argue with your logic. I just think, other than the fact that I think it relies too much on questioning the extent of Pete Carroll's hubris as an NFL coach.
So would you be willing to sell low on Penny and Walker if you have them in
I think their
leagues where you
values.
can trade them.
I don't think you can trade them. I mean, in what formats? I mean, obviously Walker still has dynasty value. And I assume quite a bit of it. Maybe so low on. I don't think Penny has really like the stuff that I'm hearing in leagues where I have Penny with co-managers, and we're seeing that the projections still look favorable for him because of, just natural regression on play volume and expectations. Like a projection is going to make the offense look a little bit better than it's been. And it's like, I don't want to start Penny this week at all. I have no desire to start Penny. Right. And that's, I have no desire to start him either, but I'm kind of okay with it. It's still pretty early, but in terms of the value of these guys in trade, like, I don't know, like, what is the value? I think the market was down on them coming into the year. Their ADPs were very low because people were concerned about exactly what we've seen, a split backfield where Travis Homer's, it's 2 down backs in a bad offense. That was the thing that got brought up a lot. I think we have to see the shift you're saying. I don't think it's impossible. I'm saying I do think it's possible that they keep doing the wrong thing for the whole year because they've done that. Seattle has done that before.
Yeah, a lot of the price though is just that market shift that we talked about at the beginning of the show, where you have backs in the same general range in Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Antonio Gibson, Kareem Hunt, these guys, Miles Sanders, these guys playing well. I think that those players are sell highs, and that's something that I recommend in the article. But there are also scenarios in which they could continue to score in the short term, and you would have preferred to kind of ride that out and just eventually take the 0 in a trade to have those points right now during the season until all of those things happen. Now, one of the things is that the Chiefs were so bad in week 2 that their numbers are sort of stealth poor in terms of how we would look at them and how that could continue to shift as we go through. It's one of the reasons that Rojo continues to be an interesting stash there. You talked about some of the guys who people should be stashing, or some of these offenses we should be targeting. Samaje Perine continues to be sort of the number one name there. J.K. Dobbins, somebody that everybody should be trying to trade for.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about Isaiah Spiller. Somebody people should be trying to get. Tyler Algier, people should be trying to stash. I think that Boston Scott is someone that you should stash, simply because in an offense that's that powerful, that fluke touchdown becomes more interesting with how low the running back scoring is, and the fact that we haven't seen clear options emerge through a couple of weeks. That's something that you can potentially play in the interim.
Before you ask me the other question, I'll first say I know I'm biased against Philly. It's such a heavy confirmation bias I'm feeling on them right now, so don't listen to me on Philly. To your point about Miles Sanders and those guys that sell highs, I wanted to throw out Cordero Patterson, who I had a hard time with in week 1 stealing signals. I talked about how his 24 rush attempts were noise, and I got a couple of my readers responding that I was probably being unfair to Patterson, and I went back in the part 2 introduction and specifically addressed that and said, look, I was really in on Patterson last year when his usage didn't necessarily look good. We were on Stealing Penny and Shawn talking about how he was clearly a big part of their offense, one of their basically 2 players that had difference-making potential, him and Pitts last year. There's a little difference now that there are 3 because London is clearly a hit. But last year it was like, they're going to find ways to use him. And that was something like, don't try to predict it too much. That was something I wrote about in Stealing Signals from basically week 1. And I had a lot of people credit me for why they got Patterson after week 1, when he became more of a popular waiver pickup after week 2, when we'd seen it for 2 weeks, went on to have a great year. So I kind of went this year in to say, look, this is how I feel about Patterson. Still a very positive thing on him, but I was just kind of calling the extent of his usage in week 1 noise because of Damian Williams. I do feel very positively about Cordero Patterson in terms of what he can do even going forward. But when you were talking about the Sanders stuff, those guys could continue to produce. I think he's a really great example of a guy that people were very high on after week 1. Even just me saying that his 24 carries was a little bit of noise and had to come back down. It was 6 more than any of his games last year. And then he has just a really poor week 2 and no one's talking about him this week. I mean, that's what can happen. He fits to me a low expected points running back, in a bit of a committee. He fits Josh Jacobs and Miles Sanders and those other names that you mentioned, Antonio Gibson, where I just wanted to give that as an example to your point that what happened with Cordell Patterson from after week 1 to after week 2 in terms of his perception, I think shifted significantly. And so I think that was a great point. What was the next direction?
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about a couple of guys that we like, or a guy we like versus one that we don't. One of the reasons for the Seattle play is that I think that Rashaad Penny and Ken Walker can end up as two of the most talented running backs in the NFL. And that is risky to bet against, or it's fun to bet on if the price is favorable, which it has been. Probably, as you mentioned, in terms of trade, buy it even lower. Some of those other names we talk about as being sell highs, probably the talent that they have is a little bit more limited in their ability to maintain a gap over other players within their own offense, maintain their volume, and maintain some of the early season efficiency they've had, probably a little bit lower. Kenneth Gainwell has been disappointing in the Eagles offense. He would probably be one of my couple biggest disappointments in terms of what I actually really wanted to see happen in week 2. The other one is that the Cardinals did this bizarre thing where they looked awful in week 1. And one of their reactions to it was saying, well, we're going to get Darrell Williams involved. And you're like, why are you going to get one of the least efficient players in the entire NFL involved? They do that, and James Conner gets hurt, and Williams actually makes some big plays. You can kind of go in again, look in the tools. You can see that last year his advanced rushing numbers were, they weren't catastrophic. They were below whatever that is, right? But he does actually make some very nice plays in week 2.
When you said they weren't catastrophic, I thought you were saying they weren't that bad, but they were below that. Okay, understood.
But they're going to want to get him involved in week 2. They do get him involved. There's an injury. He has the role and actually makes some plays. And we talk about sequencing and how that can be misleading in so many ways. If you have a guy that you brought in and you say you're going to get him involved, and then he does something when you do that is outside of his normal profile, that's what it's very easy to latch onto mentally for the coaching staff and think, okay, well, this is what he is. The reason that he wasn't involved in week 1 is that other guys on their team, specifically Benjamin, beat him out so convincingly in terms of all the practices they're having. But then you have this pressure of, you brought this guy in, he did these things for the Chiefs. He makes these plays in this game, including having the goal line touchdown. So, again, we're rooting from a fantasy perspective, and it's frustrating because you want Benjamin to be the guy there. Now it's very confusing because it seems like the injury to James Conner is not serious. He could, play again this week. If not this week, then he'll be playing again shortly. It becomes maybe this 3-person committee. So we're glad not to be in on Conner from a redraft perspective. We did move Conner in our Dynasty League. That part is always sort of unfortunate because we really like James Conner. But I think that what we saw in the second half with the Cardinals is going to be more like what they are. They do have reinforcements coming at the receiving positions for later in the season. This offense is going to score a lot of points. It's going to create a lot of value for the running backs. I pretty strongly believe that. If it's split between 3 guys, or if Conner goes down and it's split between 2 guys and Williams is back into some of these more high value touches, that part's going to be tough if you're trying to play some Benjamin.
So Eno did get 1 green zone touch and Williams only got 1, and he did convert it, but they both got 1. They played very similar snaps. They ran very similar routes. It was like a 50-50 backup situation that I think is mostly being the perception on it, mostly influenced by the fact that Williams scored and he had a 30-yard run.
I think those are going to stick for the coaching staff. As well.
Those are going to stick for the coaching staff. Absolutely. There's the right when you brought this up, I had a little mini rant on it in Stealing Signals, but I didn't have the energy to do it again. We did this with Rondale Moore all last year, but and to rewind on Rondale Moore, I don't know when you mentioned it, Sean, but it was recent, maybe one of our earlier shows this week. he had such a great first couple of games and had a very explosive play in his second game. I just pull up his game log: 4 for 68 in week 1 last year, 7 for 114 in a TD in week 2. They have a 1-point win. Part of that is he had a fantastic 77-yard TD on sort of a scramble drills, like one of his only deep targets all year. 172 receiving yards in weeks 1 and 2 for a rookie in his first 2 career games.
I ran across that because I was trying to figure out where Garrett Wilson and Drake London ranked this century in terms of rookie performances through 2 weeks. I'm looking at that list and I'm seeing Rondell Moore, and it's like completely blocked so much of that because of what they did subsequently.
Yeah, and that's why all of last year, instead of the signals I was writing about, they got to use Rondell Moore more. They basically just decided to use him less. And then when DeAndre Hopkins got hurt, there was one game where they played him pretty heavily out of the slot and they kicked Christian Kirk outside. But other than that, that was the game that AJ Green also missed. I think it was maybe due to COVID or whatever. He had a 1-game absence. So they kicked Kirk outside. They got more on the field. Other than that, they went with AJ Green and Antoine Wesley as their outside receivers and Christian Kirk in the slot and kept Rondell Moore off the field. When you had another configuration, I understand Kirk's better in the slot, but you had another configuration that clearly gets more talent on the field, right? And then now early this year, we're seeing a similar dynamic, not with Moore, but with Trey McBride. They haven't even decided to really use him or even tried to use him at all, despite Moore being hurt and Hopkins being suspended and your passing game not particularly looking great. They deactivated him in week 1. They activated him in week 2. They play him 1 snap. I did have someone send me the snap. He got absolutely blown up he was like pass blocking and he got completely ran over. Wasn't a great rep, but they're not even trying to use him or see what he can be. Moore actually started those first 2 games of the year last year, didn't start another game until week 9. I think Cliff Kingsbury is not just the worst coach in the NFL at knowing what he needs from players, what they can give him, how talent wins at the NFL. I think it's not close. I think he is completely and utterly clueless in terms of which players he should be allocating playing time to. It is mind-bogglingly stupid. There's a veteran deference element to it. Where like they're still running out AJ Green. AJ Green, we talked all last year, looked terrible. Looked like you had my favorite quote probably in Stealing Bananas history, that he looked offended to be thrown a football. That was this week. I kept thinking about it this week. He looked offended all through overtime. He would not have caught that. I don't even think he caught the 2-point conversion that allowed the Cardinals to force overtime and then go on to eventually win. I don't think he would have caught it if it wouldn't have been such a perfectly placed ball. I'm not even sure he did. He looked offended to have to catch that pass. Kyler Murray is literally standing back there telling him, move to the open space, and then throwing it to that space. And then A.J. Brown moves and makes the play and looks offended that he has to move over to catch the game-tying play. Every other pass that A.J. Green got in that game, again, looked offended. Zach Ertz getting all of these targets. I went back and watched a bunch of it. He's running the same boring ass routes every single time. He ran like a tight end screen. He ran a couple over routes, but late in the game, he had 4 catches in the fourth quarter in comeback mode and then 1 in overtime. All 4 of them were 4 or 5 yard stop plays. They're not, I can't even call them curls. He's walking like a freaking grandpa with a walker, turning around, and they're just throwing it to him against soft defenses in garbage time and comeback mode. Look, Zach Ertz, great player in his day, not explosive player at any point anymore. He put up numbers in this game. That's why I'm trying to emphasize that those numbers were a little bit misleading. They were like, he's not even running routes. You have Trey McBride to maybe potentially see as a rookie could bring something to your offense. I mean, but the only positive thing I can say in any of this is that like they've allowed Greg Dortch to play a little bit, because this guy looks like he has a little bit of juice in him as a slot receiver too. But now that's like maybe blocking Rondell Moore. He's out again in week 3, and it's like they're not rushing Rondell Moore back because they have Greg Dortch on the field. Dortch actually, though, might be half decent. I will say that.
No one's more excited than Blair Andrews, who wrote a glowing piece on him as a prospect when he came out of college.
Yeah, I mean, he had a great prospect profile, so that's a fun look back. He's been around for a few years now in the NFL, finally getting an opportunity to play and showing that college production does still matter. Like, he's a good football player. He can earn volume and he can produce. the guys that they consistently run out there are so confusing. So the Darrell Williams thing, to your point, I absolutely agree. It's going to matter to them. They, first of all, wanted to go to him for whatever reason. Like you said, they saw all through camp that, Benjamin beat him out. And then they decide they need to use him in week 2. He's going to be this helpful piece. And then he does have a 30-yard run and he does score a touchdown. And those two things are going to be enough. In Benjamin's defense, it's probably a 50-50 split there. But just over the last couple of years, I mean, Kyler Murray's gotten a lot of, there's been a lot of discussion about Kyler Murray, about the offseason contract and the work ethic and this and that and the other thing. This dude has had to throw to players that don't want to play the wide receiver position, that don't add anything. I think he has actually played better quarterback over the last 2 years than people realize, because he's carrying anything AJ Green is doing is because of Kyler Murray. Anything that Zach Ertz is doing is because of Kyler Murray. I mean, these guys are not adding anything on the field. They're just going out there and like going through the motions. They are like the definition of replacement level routes. And it's Kyler either extending plays or seeing them or hitting them or throwing to certain windows that's allowing them to actually make plays. And they have some talent, but they don't know how to use it. They don't try to use it. Am I wrong about any of this? Is this hyperbolic? How bad of a coach is Cliff Kingsbury?
Well, when I asked about these two guys, I didn't mean to. Such an open wound. It is frustrating as an Arizona Cardinals fan. The Cardinals have not looked good. But I want to ask you about some of the running backs added this week. I think that we probably should run through them quickly to give people a sense of where we are. We have a cool tool on the site which gives you the FFPC waiver report for week 3. Now, this is obviously a somewhat deep format. Not everybody is playing in those kinds of formats, but it gives you a feel for who the high stakes players are stashing. If you're in a 16 roster spot league, you can use that as sort of a look ahead type of waivers. And the reason I bring this up, Darrell Williams, who we were just talking about, was the most added player. If you look at the main event and the FPC put together last week, 847 ads, an average winning bid of 134. I bid $1 on him in a lot of leagues, because sometimes you're actually in a league where no one bids. Wan'Dale Robinson we got for $1 in one of our leagues. And in leagues where more than, in leagues where people noticed that he was available, he did go for quite a bit more than that in some places. So we were grateful to get him for $1. Darrell Williams, 134. Is that I could easily have seen his price actually being higher than that this week. I'm surprised it's really only 134.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about how the Cardinals offense is made for some good running back production for a lot of different guys. Kenyon Drake has gone on to look like, the Cardinals offense might have boosted him up based on his time with the Raiders and early this year with the Ravens. I mean, he had a couple moments with the Raiders. He had a couple moments with the Dolphins prior to coming over to Arizona, but I definitely think his decent stretch with Arizona was in part because the offense is good for running back production. That might have been the case a little bit with Chase Edmonds, might have been the case a little bit with James Conner. If that's the case, then it can help Darrell Williams. And so I can understand why people want to get into it. But like I said, if you look at the actual usage numbers, it's not like Eno wasn't the backup. They were 50-50. Like you said, the coaches might look at this and it might be more Darrell Williams than Eno in the backup role next week. And so if Connor, who looks like he's going to play, were to re-injure or something and miss time, and Darrell Williams finds himself in a 70% snap role in this offense, I mean, he was usable with the Chiefs last year. I mean, this is all my way of saying I don't really get it. I would not have spent $100, 10% of a budget on this multiple path. You need Connor out. You also need him to beat out, Benjamin. And then you also need him to be good, which there's questions if he is.
Other running backs lurking there too, who, if Benjamin fails for some reason, would probably also factor in. Another offense people want a part of, especially perhaps now that Trey Lance will not be vulturing goal line rushes. Marlon Mack, 483 ads, 3 drops, average winning bid, 38. Stash or don't stash?
Don't have a problem with it. I mean, I thought he looked better in the preseason than most people seem to, but maybe I was wrong. I thought he was pretty decisive, one cut, like getting upfield. I talked about it at one point on the show that maybe that's because I was never really high on him with his last couple of years with the Colts, but I thought he looked like his pre-injury self, pretty decent. Further removed from his Achilles than a guy like James Robinson. But seeing Robinson play well, I mean, I don't know. The Texans cutting him, I took as a pretty negative sign that he must have not looked as good in practices, and maybe I was missing something, and I would trust their actions over my film takes. So it's a little bit sketchy. I'd still rather stash Jordan Mason, even though he has not played a single offensive snap while being active the last 2 weeks. Tyrion Davis-Price leapfrogged him. He had a good preseason. They talked about how he beat out Trey Sermon. He's mostly rostered. So, Mac was that in these high stakes formats. Mac was the ad this week. But I think for the shallower formats, I think Mason's the one that I would rather have going into this week. Has been with the team, knows the offense better. I think he gets some carries this week.
And he was added 75 times, dropped 7, average winning bid on him 80, so quite a bit higher than Marlon Mack, a little bit twice as high. One I'm a little bit surprised by, Joshua Kelly, 332 ads. This may be the dynamic that you're talking about where people just don't feel like there's anybody they can add. The average winning bid, though, only 22. The next guy on the list, Haskins, 241 ads, 28 drops. We actually dropped him from some teams. We added him last week because there were some better ads to make. Average winning bid, 27.
Either added him elsewhere too, though. Yeah, I dropped him in some leagues, added him in some leagues. I think he's definitely on a stash list, right? He's stashable. Got a lot of carries late after the blowout with the backups. The Bills had put their backups in, and he looked fine. He averaged more than 4 yards a carry, 9 carries. I think that run that he got was pretty useful and was knowledge that if Henry were to miss, that he's probably the most likely backup. Obviously, Dontrell Hilliard wasn't playing, but Hilliard isn't. Haskins is more physically the Derrick Henry role, and then like last year it was Deontay Foreman in the Henry role, and it was Jeremy McNichols in what the role that Hilliard might play. That's the way I would expect it to be. Their offense is still going to be an early down run team. Haskins could be a 15 carry guy if Henry were to miss time.
And Haskins really impressed as a receiver in the preseason, both in terms of making catches, but also the coaching staff raved about his blocking on pass plays. That perhaps would give him a chance for a bigger role in that high value portion of the game than maybe it seems like after Hilliard had those couple touchdown catches in week 1. Gus Edwards, 169 ads, an interesting one there. Elijah Mitchell, 157. So someone who actually was dropped because he's going to miss half the season and does burn a lot of, and it burns that key roster spot for a long time. The average winning bid was 216. Ben, we were able to get him
for 116 or 112 or something like that. We put some feeler bids out there. I saw him go for over 400. I saw him go for cheaper as well around where we got him. Wide range there, which kind of makes sense because I don't think not everyone factors in how costly it is on the roster spot side. But yeah, you have to put a lot of resources into adding him back in terms of budget plus a roster spot for a long time. And that's part of why I wanted to keep our bids a little bit in check. But obviously to get a player like Elijah Mitchell on the waiver wire, if he does play late in the year on some of these 0RB teams, I mean, it's a really nice opportunity. And so it was good to get him cheap in some spots. That's not a small thing though, what you just said, to have to just have him. It's a 2-month timeline. We're talking about half the season into the buys, holding a player, and then hoping that he's recovered enough when he does come back that he gets right back to a big role and no one else is.
Yeah, I mean, they could have somebody else play well
right.
enough.
Yeah.
But he's, you lose the starting job just because one of your teammates is so good. There maybe are some similarities there to what Rashaad Penny did last season, where Penny wasn't involved really in the shootout portion of redraft high stakes because when he was dropped by people last year, locked him and kept him off of teams. Michael Hitchcock and I bid in the 230s and got him by $10 or so in one of our FPC teams. That was kind of fun. The high winning bid on him, 851. So definitely some folks who feel like he can be that postseason winner for them. Justice Hill, a lot of ads. Sony Michel, a lot of ads. Tyler Algier, a lot of ads. Algier, I think, pretty clearly the guy there. I maybe surprised when you consider how bad they looked that people are still adding these Charger backups when there's no clarity and they're not particularly good. But you talked about what offenses we want exposure to. People clearly want exposure to the Chargers.
Yeah, I mean, Eckler went out last year. Justin Jackson had a great year. I mean, the thing that I would caution is that Jackson was running routes when Eckler had a couple of concussion scares early in the year and looked like he was going to be the passing down back. Clearly, Michelle and Kelly, I don't think there's any clarity whatsoever about who would be taking the valuable pass work. And they're not even, like you said, they haven't even been very productive or particularly good in like the short yardage stuff. But that's not the whole element here. I'm with you. I don't really have, like, as good as this offense can be, I don't really have a ton of, I think if Eckler goes down this year, that you're not looking at a Justin Jackson play. You're looking at them passing more. You're looking at more Herbert. You're looking at somebody out of the backfield that's going to be usable. And maybe that's Kelly. I don't know. But I don't think we have enough of a sample on Kelly to suggest that it's not him. And I don't really have interest in holding him and waiting for an injury. One of the things with handcuffs, even if it's a good backfield, if it's so ambiguous, you don't even know you're going to get the payoff. And we talk about Hassan Haskins. I think we feel pretty good about some payoff if the injury occurs. And I mean, I've argued before that people pay too much attention to that side of that, EV equation of the possibility of it happening. But we're so often wrong on the handcuff. I mean, like you've been saying with Isaiah, it could be Isaiah Spiller. He's probably active at that point. And he might end up just looking better than the other two. Good prospect in his own right. Kelly and Michelle don't look good, like you said. I like your call on Algier, though. I mean, I don't think people are very excited about what that role could be. And so it was a great time to get a hold of him because Williams is on IR. Damian Williams going to miss several more weeks. It's an opportunity for Algier. And Mike Davis was just not very good last year. He hasn't been very good with the Ravens early this year. People, I think that second back role with the Falcons doesn't have any value. But if Algier is good, and especially with a rushing quarterback, which should help the rushing efficiency, he didn't have a great first game, to be clear. But if he's good, he has the potential to take that role to a level that it hasn't been yet. It would hurt Cordarrelle Patterson as well, but it would also free them up to use Patterson in different ways. They want to have someone taking 10 carries a game alongside Patterson. I mean, that was clear last year when they kept using Mike Davis, even though he was horrible. They didn't let Patterson just take over the backfield when he was astronomically better. That was the concern I had with Patterson in week 1, was that just because Damian Williams got hurt, that's why Patterson got 24 carries. And we saw this week 10 carries for Algier. I think he has the potential to go from 10 to 12 to 15 if he's running efficiently and looks good. And he's in the role already. So he's an easy ad.
My thought on Algier is that the blowback on Kyle Pitts is going to make them pass heavy enough in the short term.
Yeah.
That maybe you don't get the immediate points. And then the hard part is that on a few of these guys, and specifically some of these rookies, you may have to have a little bit of patience. Again, depending on the number of roster spots you have, that patience may not really be possible, both from a psychological perspective, but also just very much a pragmatic perspective in terms of how you have to manipulate your roster. But that role that you're talking about was worth almost 10 expected points per game last year. That's a huge number for someone who is borderline free.
Yeah.
And we don't know that it's going to be that big this year. We don't know it's all going to go to him, but.
And what if Cordarrelle Patterson gets hurt? I mean, we haven't really talked about how the whole backfield would have to be restructured. There's this concern that when Damian Williams comes back, Algier's time might be up. But what if Patterson then misses some time later and it's Algier and Williams, and they're using maybe Williams more in the passing game? He's always been a really good receiver. But you can see splits there where Algier winds up having even more than 10 expected points.
Yeah. And I mean, we like Damian Williams, but if there's a guy here, a situation where one of the backups wins conclusively and then goes on to big numbers, it would seem to be tilted in favor of Algier. I mean, Damian Williams hasn't gotten a great opportunity since he started in the postseason with the Chiefs a couple years ago. Maybe he's still that guy. And the Falcons, for everything that we get frustrated by with Arthur Smith, and there's a lot, he has been able to generate rushing points for the teams he's coached. So maybe some similarities to a Kevin Stefanski in that specific area. Then this has been a lot of fun. We enjoyed Thursday Night Football. Deontay Johnson scores more than 16 fantasy points, fails to make some catches we would have liked to have seen him make. But overall, a good day from him. You mentioned one of the greatest all-time catches there from George Pickens. A kind of fun little note. Blair's had some cool articles over the last couple of years about hand size and prospects, how it's not linear, how the big hands actually do show up as being something that's beneficial. I point that out because I also want to always emphasize that skills matter, because George Pickens has tiny hands. Now, I'm sure they're still way larger than mine, but he has tiny hands for an NFL wide receiver. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can't go out there and make some of these unbelievable catches just because you have small hands. Having good hands is the thing that also comes into play. Pat Freiermuth.
We always say that Blair's full of crap. I'm just kidding.
We have a couple of garbage time catches from Pat Freiermuth. We have further commitment to Mitchell Trubisky, who, I mean, I'm rooting for him, but I mean, he looks completely overmatched and overwhelmed. We didn't get the Pickett stash. Ben, I did make that play on some of my rosters.
I was super excited about that. But yeah, anyone who's curious, I'm going to probably be moving on from him on Sunday waivers and FFPC, because they came right out and said they're not going to make a quarterback change, which I forgot about. How Mitchell Trubisky has that knack for the second he's ready to get benched, he throws a couple good passes, and then the coach is like, well, he's doing just well enough. Like, he came out early in this game too and looked okay early, because like if he looked like crap, he would have maybe got pulled in this game. And then he struggled for multiple quarters. And then late in the game, when they needed a little life, he threw some good passes to get him down into scoring position, and then couldn't finish the drive. I mean, it's just the total Mitch Trubisky show, but he always has that ability to, when it looks bleakest, look just enough like the coach is then going to be like, well, maybe I was right with the decision I already made, because it's hard for them to then admit they were wrong and move to a different decision. So they're going to stick with Trubisky for a while. After the Jets at home, when they had 10 days of prep, that I thought that week 4 game could be a start. They get the Bills and the Bucks. They're not going to, I think they're both on the road. They're not going to roll out Pickett for those games. I think the earliest you might see him now is week 7. He doesn't start in week 4, or come in potentially mid-game in week 4. Now the Bucks game's at home, but still, you're talking about, it's actually at the Bills, at home versus the Bucks, at Miami, at Philly, and then a bye week. So it might even be week 10 coming out of the bye, home game. I don't get it, because the Steelers, I mean, their season might be over by that point, but now I look ahead at their schedule and I say now has to be the change. You have to get Pickett in there for the Jets game, but they're going to stick with Trubisky.
You do see some of those frozen ropes to the sideline that are actually long passes. Some nice plays to Deontay Johnson. That physical talent can help you when you're trying to keep that starting job. Of some of those wow throws, there's a reason he was drafted so early. Unfortunately, being an NFL quarterback requires such a varied skill set, and he doesn't appear to have all of the skills necessary to lead a team. So many 3 and outs in that game, and they basically didn't have the ball in the second half. And
some of that's sequencing, play calling on, going run pass. Arif Hassan is, the great longtime Vikings guy. I think he's doing national stuff now. He's been joking for a long time since Trubisky was with the Bears that he can only throw to the right side. He sent out his pass chart during the game, and Trubisky had thrown, I think, only like 3 passes last night to the left side. I mean, you're talking about an NFL quarterback who's, again, displaying these low-level tendencies where he can only throw to one side of the field. I mean, we saw that last night. So not ideal. I think he threw more to the left later in the game, but it was like setting things up very clearly to the left. I think teams know this about him too. He has a strong tendency on broken plays and all that. He has to go right. So anyway, not an NFL quarterback.
No, unfortunately not. But a fun game last night, nonetheless. And we have a whole host of exciting matchups for Sunday in week 3. I can't wait. That'll do it for today's episode of Stealing Bananas. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch. Make sure you follow him at Yards Per Gretch. Sign up for Stealing Signals. Sign up for Stealing Lines. Join us at RotoViz. We'd love to have you guys subscribe to the feed. You'll get these episodes as soon as they come out. When you do, leave us a rating and review. Ben, I think as of about 24 hours ago, we were at 198 on Apple. There's a chance if you go in there and leave a review right now, you could be number 200. Maybe we've gone past that in the last 24 hours. Who knows? But we really appreciate all of those. You guys have been absolutely fantastic. Good luck to the entire Stealing Bananas community as you go out there and win those fantasy matchups in week 3. We'll talk to you guys soon.